Well, welcome everybody to Brainstorming the Human Connection. And we're going to have some fun today. You know, eh, I don't know how many of you remember because sometimes our memories are really short. But George Floyd was murdered on was July, I think, 25th. Sometimes I get the Julys and Junes mixed up, but it's coming up on the anniversary of his murder, and we thought it would be a good idea to kind of look at how that's maybe changed how policing is done and what kind of things did that affect. We know that it had lots of effects. We know that afterwards, there were a lot of calls for police reform, and there were people who had some ideas, and some of them good, some of them, let's say, less than optimal. But we did see some movement, and so it just seemed like it would be a good idea for us to relook at that, and see where we've gone and where we should be going, where we came from, how that's changed. So we're going to take a little bit different turn. We're going to talk to a highway patrolman today. And this highway patrolman has, let's say, a lot of skin in the game, so to speak. And he has been looking at what kind of changes could be made, should be made. And he's having a little bit of trouble getting on, I think, because something with the technical stuff. But Colby is working on that now. But I want to take this opportunity while we're working that technical stuff out to remind you that this is an interactive program. It really happens when we get people to ask questions, make comments, add their 2 cents in, because no one of us will be as smart as all of us. It's just not possible because we see things from different points of view. We have different questions that we're asking. We have different life experiences that cause us to view sometimes the same things in a much different way. So that means that how we will find solutions and the kind of solutions that we will find will be quite different, because if you make a different diagnosis, you're going to have a different remedy. And sometimes when we look at things like interaction between citizens and the police force, often depends on how you grew up. For example, in the community I grew up with, we heard that the policeman is your friend. They might have said that in your school, but no parents ever told that to their kids, that your policeman is your friend. They would say you should respect the policeman. They would say, don't mouth out to the policeman. And they would tell you all of those kind of things, but they would never say the policeman is your friend. Part of the reason is that if they did, they would lose all credibility, because you knew that the policemen, they were a lot of things, but they were not your friend. You never had experiences, but on the other hand, if you grew up where if you say, hey, Mr. Policeman, my cat's in the tree and he can't come down, and the policeman made some effort, any effort to try to get your your cat out of the tree, you felt like, well, this is my friend. If they had the police athletic league, okay, so if the police came out and they were part of your athletic league and you had that interaction with them, and you played ball, they pitched the ball to you and showed you how to catch and stuff like that, and you didn't even know if he was a corporal, a sergeant, or a patrolman, or anything. You didn't know any of that, and you didn't care because that wasn't your relationship with that officer or the officers. Then yeah, you could see that the policeman, you could have a sense that the policeman is your friend. And if you had a problem, you should, you should and could call the police to help you out of that problem. They were problem solvers. You could have that approach, but everybody didn't do that. Everybody didn't have that kind of relationship. So now I think finally there are people who are saying, hey, we can do better. Yeah, we've had some problems. Yes, we still have problems today, but we can do better. And it doesn't, it might be a struggle in some cases because, personal change can be really hard. It's like, sometimes I think we underestimated how hard it is for us to change our attitudes about things, especially if we're changing in a way that we're completely unfamiliar with. We're asking ourselves to trust that it's going to be okay without any real experience or evidence that that trust is going to be respected. So it looks like we have Julian. Can you get on now? Hey, look.
I am here.
Live and in color, live in color.
That's right. That's right. I'm not sure what's going on. I got a gentleman here who tried to hop on too, and he did it from Facebook, and it brought him right on, but I was having issues. So sorry about that.
Yep. Right. Well, welcome. I held off even saying your name, in the introduction, because every time I think I know how to say your last name, then I think, no, I don't really know how to say it. How do you say it?
Well, no, go ahead and try it. I like to see how miserably people fail at it.
Yeah, Beaudion.
Nope.
Or Beaudion.
Beaudoin.
Beaudoin. Oh,
Beaudoin.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's more like the Cajun version.
It is. Yeah, it's not as French.
Not as French. Okay,
Right.
Beaudoin. Okay. Beaudoin. And I know I've asked you this question probably 10 or 15 times, and then I always think I have it. And then if I go to sleep, it drains out on the pillow. And then the next time I think. And that's because I think part of the reason is I think of it and I see it as a French name. But then I remembered when you told me, no, it's not the regular French way.
Well, that's just how much. That's how much I mean to you, Lawrence. You can't remember how to say
exactly. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah. Well, let's start off this conversation really by giving these nice folks some kind of background and tell them, who is Julian Beaudion.
Well, so I've been in law enforcement as a state trooper here in South Dakota for a little bit over 12 years, pretty close to 13 years. Aside from that, I am also the executive director of the South Dakota African American History Museum, as well as the executive director of Juneteenth Sioux Falls. And so those are just the organizations that I have leadership roles in. Well, I guess, and recently I was elected as the vice president of the new chapter of the NAACP here in Sioux Falls, which is also covering South Dakota. So just a shameless plug, we are looking for members. If you're not a member, please join the NAACP. You can find us on Facebook, just NAACP Sioux Falls. So those are the organizations that I have leadership roles in. My wife and I also own 2 businesses in town. The main business being Swamp Daddy's Cajun Kitchen in Sioux Falls, which is located in downtown area on Phillips Avenue. And then we have another really small business called Do-Gooders, in which we pick up dog waste, and then a certain percentage of that profit goes right back into the community, hence the word Do-Gooders. And so those are just some of the things I do, other than serving on several boards of directors, and working on some business initiatives through an organization that I co-founded called the Hub South Dakota, which is a nonprofit that works to bring resources and business development to the BIPOC community, specifically BIPOC entrepreneurs and business professionals. And so that's just a little bit about me. Been working in the community for quite a while. Love what I do. People ask me, hey, with the list of things that you're a part of, how do you have time? And I always tell them, you find time for things that you love to do. So that's just a little bit about me.
Okay, great. That gives us a kind of 50,000-foot view. As you know, knowing you, I know that there's a lot under the hood that we won't get into, but still,
Sure.
that gives people some kind of context or framework in which to have this conversation. So,
Absolutely.
yeah. So, as we mentioned while you were struggling with the tech issues, we're coming up on the anniversary of George Floyd's murder. And I would like to first kind of explore, how did that impact you?
The impact was heavy in a couple different ways. So I had the unique opportunity and the privilege of leading the George Floyd March here in Sioux Falls. That march, when we first started organizing the march, it was probably expected to be, 500 to 700 people, and it ended up being about 7,000 to 8,000. And so, with that said, it was an overwhelming experience to see how many people showed up. That was unexpected. And then, when I say I had the opportunity to lead the march, part of what we did very strategically was what we looked at other cities in the country to see how their marches had gone, how they turned violent, and we wanted to avoid all of that. So we sent out invitations to the governor, we sent out invitations to the mayor, the Chamber of Commerce. So if you don't kind of know the narrative around the Chamber of Commerce at the time, they were promoting the march to be violent before it even took place. And they had a couple promotions going out on their social media pages saying that that Black Lives Matter was sending busfuls of people from North Dakota and Minnesota, and that was untrue. So with that said, we tried to really control the narrative as much as possible by inviting those players to the table to say, hey, let's not be at odds here. Let's organize this thing together. Let's learn from what other communities have done from their mistakes to make sure that this thing goes well. So Chamber of Commerce did not join in on those conversations. They continued to form their own narrative. And our governor, she said she would be there and she never showed up to the meeting. So, whatever took place at that time for her just took place. I understand how busy she is and how busy she can be, so I'm not gonna form my own opinion based on that. However, we did have some conversations with the city, with the mayor and chief of police. And so, we felt everything to be under control. And it absolutely was. Part of the strategy was to make sure that we started off understanding that this was a peaceful protest. So here in Sioux Falls, we do have a statue of MLK. And MLK was done by a local artist. The statue was done by a local artist from when he visited the city. And so he stood for peace. And so we said, well, let's hold it in an area of the city that's very symbolic when it comes to peace. And so that area was right at the statue of MLK. And so we started off that way. I gave a speech, and then we walked to the courthouse. Another individual gave a speech, and then we finished it in the parking lot of the police department. Again, all of this was under control. All of this is with city permission, and all of this is with the police department, not necessarily marching with us, but trying their best to control the atmosphere. And then, of course, several hours later, in a totally different place, at least 9.8 miles. I don't know if I measured right or not, but 9.8 miles away from where we held the peaceful protest, there was a riot that began. So I found myself on the front lines of the protest, the peaceful protest, and then I got called in as a trooper that night, and I found myself on the front lines of this riot. And so in riot gear, after I just gave the speech, after we had things under control, all of a sudden we didn't. And so if you want to talk about a tug of war, that was a tug of war. I knew what I stood for. I know what I currently stand for. And I know at the time for sure, I did not stand for, the act of violence that was committed by the police officer in Minnesota. So it still pulls at me because, you know, law enforcement is my career. It's what I do. It's the only thing I've known. Yeah, as far as work is concerned. But you know, as I tell people all the time, I can take the uniform off, but I can't take the skin off. I'm a Black man first, and my community comes before anything.
I think that's a very insightful way to paint a picture that gives a lot of facets to like the internal struggles that a person goes through. And I think that there seems to be a lack of appreciation for the conflict between what the officer is projecting as an officer and what they are on the other side of that uniform. And I think we don't give enough space to the conflict that can produce. But let's go back to talk about then the way that policing has been impacted, because we saw a lot of initiatives after that. And I think part of the reason is because people saw with their own eyes, as opposed to having to have he said, she said stories. They saw with their own eyes a person being snuffed out on camera. And if there was ever a snuff video, that was a snuff video. And I think that impacted people in a way that they never realized that they could be impacted. But let's talk a little bit about where we are now as far as the difference between then and now. Have you seen any particular changes in the way police departments are responding to people of color, for lack of better terms? I think all the people have color, but that's another discussion. What kind of changes have you? Where are we now as far as like police departments?
Well, quite honestly, I haven't seen a lot of change. You know, soon after the murder of George Floyd, there was a lot of conversation, and the biggest question was, you know, what can we do? The conversation surrounding the what can we do seems to come from organizations outside of law enforcement, those who really didn't have a tremendous impact on the change of training, the change in mindset, the change in culture. And so those outside entities were really gung-ho at changing things from their perspective. But internally, if you can name an organization outside of, you know, Minneapolis Police Department and St. Paul and you know, those police departments surrounding the Twin Cities, if you can name any other law enforcement agency that came out and was very outspoken against the murder of George Floyd, I'd probably give you $1 million if I had it, right? Because there was no one. So when we talk about very specifically and intentionally changing the policy and the culture and the structure of an organization, and when I say organization, I mean policing overall. When you talk about that, there was no conversation about that. As a matter of fact, there have been proposals over the years prior to the murder of George Floyd because of other murders at the hands of police, specifically when it comes to Black men and women. There have been proposals submitted to, you know, to organizations nationwide about, hey, let's take these incidents, let's use these videos as training videos. And then that way, when something does happen, because let's be really honest, we're not going to prevent all incidents from happening. So when something does happen, we'll be better prepared, number one, to control the narrative when it comes out. But then also, number two, we'll be better prepared to have more effective conversation, which is the most important thing, with our community. And that way we don't see, you know, the violent riots that we've seen in the past. Maybe the protest just stops at protests, because We understand that there's an injustice and it deserves to be protested, but we also understand that, hey, our police department is not like this. They've been in communication with us since before this happened. We understand to a different level of our police department that they are also part of the community and they're not necessarily against us. So maybe this bad apple that people talk about is actually just a bad apple. But we don't have the opportunity to do that because no one took the chance, or no organization took the opportunity to really change their policies, to restructure their organization. And therefore, from there, you saw the community's reaction. And the discussion went from, hey, what do we do with these outside entities, to let's defund the police. Let's take away their resources. Let's do this and let's retrain them. And now let's put civilians in certain roles. And so the conversation became more of a defense mechanism of the community. Well, if you're not going to do it, we'll just take over and we'll defund you type thing. And you're seeing that in areas of like a St. Paul and Minneapolis, where they are. As a matter of fact, Minneapolis is going far above and beyond defunding the police. They are making attempts to abolish the police department. And that's two different conversations, right? So again, when you put the community in a position to be defensive, now you're really at odds with the community. And so we have to overcome organizational structures as well as the hatred and the violence that occurs within those organizations, in the uniform and outside of the uniform. So hopefully tying that all together makes sense.
Well, it does make sense. Let's look at the kind of things and the kind of training and incidents that brought us to this point. But before we do, I want to give our esteemed guests who are also logged in here on Zoom. Do any of you have questions, comments, things you want to know? This is your chance. Anybody, if you raise your hand or just turn on your microphone. Hearing none, for the good of the order, we'll go forward. What kinds of things do you think brought us to this point of police and community interaction, which, as I stated in my preamble, is not really optimal, and there are certain attitudes in certain communities that are different than in other communities. What brings on the police image? What creates that police image? How do we get here?
Well, I mean, if you know the history of policing, policing was created based on fear. And the modern day policing system is actually based on a system that was restructured in the 40s and 50s. Prior to that, there had been no restructure. So the origination of police started during times of enslavement, and it was to capture runaway slaves. And then from slavery, from the times of enslavement, all the way until the 1940s and 50s, right after the Great Depression right towards the end of the Great Depression, I should say, is when you started to see more of a restructure. So policing began to protect property. And so the reason why it was restructured, and again, we talk about enslavement at the time, those who were enslaved were considered the property of men because they themselves were not considered to be human beings. They were considered to be property. So then now we move into the end of the Great Depression, and we talk about those who are losing property. And this is before, voting rights, this is before civil rights, this is before all of those things in the mid 60s and 70s that we know today to be one of our quote unquote freedoms. The reason why we saw the restructure then is because, and this is very specific to white men and only white men who owned property, not all white men, but just white men who owned property. During the Great Depression, they started to lose their property. And they started to lose their property to white women. They started to lose their property to what they considered to be their own people. And so in an act of protection, those white men who owned property, majority of them were in governmental systems. Well, guess what a governmental system is? The law enforcement agencies around us are also government entities. We are controlled by the city, the county, and the state. And so when you ultimately look at the bosses of those organizations are in political positions. The sheriff is a politically appointed position. The mayor is a politically appointed position, and so is the governor. And all three of those, individuals have campaigns to run. They want to win. And so when you look at when you tie those things together, the only people that can vote at the time were white men who owned property. And so it's there, it's not hard to put the puzzle pieces together. So when those individuals started to lose their structural balances, when they started to lose their property, they also began to lose their voting power. And so you started to see politically how things change. And so they went right back to, hey, let's rebuild the system because we don't want to lose power. And that's when you started to see the structure of law enforcement be changed. Now, with that said, there were no lives lost, right? I mean, you can say that there was a lot of lives lost because of shortages of food and other things during the Great Depression, but because of law enforcement, there were no lives lost. Now we move into the 60s or the late 50s, mid 60s, and even some civil rights in the early to mid 70s as well, where we started to see peaceful protests by individuals like Dr. King. And you started to see lives lost. Well, guess who those lives were? Those were Black lives. That was Black blood that was shed. And so you started to see a push again for a restructure of policing, but it was halted. And it was halted by, again, Black blood being shed. The death of Dr. King halted all negotiation when it came to the restructure of policing. And so now we move into the early 90s, where we want to start restructuring policing again, and that was halted by the crime bill, the 94 crime bill. There were some things prior to that we can get into historically, but that would take a lot of time. But that 94 crime bill, we saw Black men, Black women, and Indigenous women, not Indigenous men yet, but Indigenous women. We saw the incarceration rate between those three skyrocket. As a matter of fact, it grew 12 times as much as it did the previous decade. And so now we're in an area to where we start to see mass incarceration. And so you look at incarceration numbers, and about 70 to 80%, depending on the state that you're in, they're going to be filled with Black men, Black women, Indigenous men, and Indigenous women. And so, you mentioned people of color earlier. These things don't affect all people of color. And I think it's very important to separate the fact that, yes, of course, all people have color to them. And that's why we can't say that this affects just people of color, because it doesn't affect all people. This is affecting a certain sect of our community, and we have to pay close attention to who it's affecting, and we have to be very, very intentional about how we come to solutions about those affected communities. So that's kind of the backstory of how we got here. Now we want to talk about, because the organizations didn't restructure anything, but now we want to talk about more of like the training. We've also seen more of a development with training in law enforcement, and training comes from militarization forces. We see the militarized weapons that have been given to us, and it's actually government surplus that has been given to us. So when we talk about militarization, we are actually holding weapons that were in war, weapons that have killed someone. The tanks that you see driving around in some cities, those came from the U.S. Department, the U.S. Army. I think the Army is actually the only surplus that the law enforcement agencies across the states get. So I'll just keep it to Army. So you talk about the militarization. We're being formed to actually be the military. And Lawrence and I kind of talked about this offline a little bit. But the training aspect of it is also to remove you from who you have always known yourself to be. You go into training, and from day one, I'm not Julian Beaudion anymore. I am Trooper Beaudion. I have a presence about myself. I am being trained to remove all emotion, which is a struggle. To be quite honest with you, it's a struggle when you're in law enforcement and you've been trained to remove emotions. It's a struggle to go back out in public and see people for being people. You're always on guard. You always have like this protective wall up. There's a barrier up. And so if you're living that way from day to day, even when you peel the uniform off, if you still have that protective wall up, and your mindset is still to remove your emotion because you know you can be called back into battle at any time, then you start to lose a sense of community. And when you take the uniform off, you are still part of the community, whether you want to be or not. Right? You still have a neighbor who's probably not in law enforcement. You still have to visit the doctor just like everybody else. You put your pants on one leg at a time, just like everyone else. And so it's really, really important to now boil that down to the root of the problem, which is now training and how we can redevelop training. Because the bigger battle is, yes, to change organizational structures. But what can we do in the meantime? And I think that's probably where you're going next. So I won't overtalk myself.
Yeah, well, I think before we actually get into that, and maybe this is part of it. I like the overview and like, departmental changes, but I also think it's important to look at the granular thing. You talked about, like the internal struggle. And so, even though we look at it as like police or policing, there's individuals behind that, as you pointed out, and each one of those individuals' struggles collectively comes out as the image that we see and remember and implant and imprint. So I'd like to maybe bounce a little bit back and forth about, okay, well, what kind of changes does this individual have to go through? How do you reconcile? Is it a way to reconcile or to help the officer find that middle ground or find a way to make that mental/emotional shift, and I'm not even sure as I'm saying this, is that even practical? Is that a thing? So could you talk a little bit about the internal struggle that the officer has and what can be done to help that? Because we can make up new rules, but if people have a hard time following them or they run into cognitive dissonance, something got to give.
Yeah. So to directly answer your question, is it possible? I think it is, I think it is a possibility, but is it reality? I think that's a different story, right? Because when you talk about human beings, any human being, we don't like to lose. Even when you're not like competitive in nature, you don't like to lose, right? You don't like to feel like power is being taken away from you. You don't like to feel like you're being cheated out of anything. And
we don't even like to lose things we should be getting rid of.
Absolutely.
We have relationships in our lives that you say, why are you even letting them in your life? But if we kick them out, it's okay. But if they just leave, then suddenly we find ourselves begging for them to come back.
Absolutely, because we want to hold the power, right? We want to hold the cards. And again, as I mentioned earlier, we want to control our own narrative, which is the important part behind law enforcement agencies being able to control their own narrative. Now, here's what I personally believe, and when I say personally, through so I'm a board member of the Regional Innocence Project. An advisory member of the Innocence Project, which is out of St. Paul. And so they fight not just to make sure that those who are incarcerated that are actually innocent are removed from the prison system, but they also fight against departments who have policies in place that are not equitable, that are not solution-based. And so we are daily working and grinding to make sure that we are making things more equitable. But with that said, the biggest pushback that we get, and here's where my personal belief comes in as well, the biggest pushback that we get is, I don't really want to review my policy, right? That's a human resources thing. You have to talk to human resources about it. As an organization, we think we are doing well. We've never had this for sure in South Dakota is one of the biggest pushbacks. Oh, we've never had that happen here before. Things are well, it's not going to happen. We're okay. And so my personal belief is, well, just because it hadn't happened doesn't mean it won't. Because at one point you look at the places like a Minneapolis or the Chicago PDs or the New York PDs, and at one point they didn't have any incidents either. At some point in time, they had to have a first, right? So how can we prepare ourselves not to go down the same path as these other agencies have gone? And so my belief is you take that policy step by step, page by page, line by line, word by word, and you make sure that it's not just affecting the people of yesterday, but it's affecting the people of tomorrow as well. You have to be able to set up a community for success. Now, when you talk about those government entities, right, your mayors and governors and whomever else, those elected officials, you might laugh at this, but I hate to call them leaders because a lot of them don't really possess leadership qualities. They are elected officials. It's a popularity contest at some levels. But those individuals, in my opinion, that when they run for office, they run based on what? You always hear this one word, transparency, right? Transparency is like the one word that they run on. But then as soon as they get in office, they don't want to be transparent about the policies of the departments that are under them. They might be transparent about their own particular department, but the policies of the departments that are underneath them that actually run our day-to-day lives, they're not very transparent about. And that includes organizations like police departments and law enforcement agencies overall. So when you talk about like moving in the right direction, number one, we have to elect actual leaders in those positions and not just those who are running for office for the next step. And then number two, we also have to be willing to talk to our law enforcement agencies and say, no, this is not a human resource problem. This is an agency problem. And it comes with two different things, in my opinion, to grasp a solution. It comes with vulnerability from the agency to open up their policy manual, to say, hey, this policy hadn't been rewritten since 1946. I think we probably need to look at that again. But then also it comes with the engagement of community members. And I think that's vastly important, right? Because again, as I stated before, the agency is made up of individuals in uniform, but when you take the uniform off, you are a community member. So it affects your spouse, it affects your children, it affects your cousins, your brothers, your sisters, so on and so forth. So if we're not going to engage the community in the way that the community wants to be engaged, in the way that the community needs to be engaged, then we're not going to come up with equitable solutions. We'll only come up with solutions based on the mindset and the culture that we've already been set in since the 1940s and 50s. So things don't change when we don't engage from a holistic perspective.
I want to open it up to our esteemed panel again. Don't wait till the last 2 minutes and then suddenly have a whole bunch of questions, because then you don't give a guy a chance to actually flesh it out and answer properly. But if you have questions, like, please pop up now. Anybody?
Lawrence, I have a question.
Colby. Yeah, Colby, go ahead.
So Julian, just to kind of keep going with what you were just saying about elected officials and some of the suggestions you had for how do we change things. Can you speak to where, as a highway patrolman, again, I'm not real familiar with the structure of that, how that works, if you have meetings with fellow highway patrolmen every now and then, or how that works, but just to some of the things that you've seen, maybe that would be a step in the right direction from your perspective in terms of making these changes that you're talking about, whether it's at highway patrolman level or police departments or just law enforcement in general. Are there things that you've observed, especially maybe in more recent months, that you would say kind of are moving toward what you believe might be a solution to some of these issues?
Yeah, I quite honestly, I have a hard time finding any progress, because there's a belief both ways, from the community and also from law enforcement. And I always say that I don't believe solely, and I want to highlight that word. If I was texting, it'd be in all caps. I don't believe solely on the 2 Ps, and the 2 Ps are picnics and protests. If the community protests and there's no cause, there's no due regard to law enforcement, then I don't believe that works. But on the flip side, if the police department is just trying to throw a picnic just to look good, right, and there's no identity behind it, and there's no focus on getting to know the community, so that you can actually go into those policies and procedures to change them based on what you've learned, then that also does no good. So that's what I've seen from local agencies, state agencies, and regional agencies. I can't speak to national level things because I'm not involved on to that point. But regionally, I can definitely speak to the agencies that we've seen regionally, and we think that those things are going to help us bond, right? Just because I know when we talk about family, we talk about getting together over food, right? A lot of the times we get together over food and people discuss things, but I know in my family, I don't see a lot of my family until there's a death or a wedding, right? That's mostly when I see my family, and there's food at both. There's food at both. But that's few and far between. So what can we do in between the food? What can we do in between the protests? What can we do in between the picnics to make sure that we're engaging with each other, we're better understanding each other? Because effectively, we can't effectively police a community until we effectively understand the community. And so if there's no effectiveness in between any of that, then none of our efforts will work, and it goes in vain. So I quite honestly, and maybe I'm being negative here. Again, I told you guys that in law enforcement we remove feelings, but maybe I'm just being negative here, or maybe my emotions are not in the same place as everyone else. But I struggle to see the progress from both parties. Engagement is so critical to progress. And so if the community is not willing to engage and the police department is not willing to engage, then we'll never see the progress. And that's the battle that we face because of the history of policing in America, and because of what we currently see right in front of our faces with all of these people, these unarmed men and women, both white and black, indigenous, Asian Americans, gays, Latinos. We see a lot of unarmed individuals. Now, the numbers are definitely guided towards Black Americans more than anything, but there are still a lot of unarmed individuals posing no threat to law enforcement officers that are being killed, and there's no accountability on the organizational side, and then the onus is put back on the community. And again, when that happens, it puts the community in modes of being defensive, and the defense almost never wins. And so we have to be able to change the culture and the mindset of not just the community, but more particularly the engagement process, the culture of engaging with each other as community members, right? We expect our doctors to do things the right way. I don't get on a plane and say, and expect the best person in the world to be the pilot. And then when something happens to where he crashes the plane, I'm not going to say, oh, he's just a bad apple, right? That's not a realistic expectation, because he has people's lives in his hands. We expect that pilot to perform his or her duty to the best of their ability at all times. And it should be no different from a person that's holding a gun and a badge. There are no bad apples. There shouldn't be the concept of having a bad apple in law enforcement. We should be trained, we should be part of the community, and we should be engaged. And if there is a bad apple, or if there is someone who is not upholding or being accountable to the things that the community wants, then they should be out of there before the mistake happens. Because when we talk about bad apples, we can't afford to have a bad apple in uniform, because lives are lost. So,
but you bring up a very interesting analogy to the airplane pilot, and I remember living in a time where you never knew if the airplane was going to fall out of the sky. There were so many of them falling out, and having crashes. But something magically happens, and now when you hear an airplane crash, it is a story. At one point, it was crashing all the time,
mm-hmm.
But what happened is policy changed, and the policy went to redundancy and built in redundancy in both the individual pilot and also the control tower there. And when I say redundancy, what I mean is if procedure A fails, there's procedure B. If procedure B fails, there's procedure C. If you get a signal that C is failing or going to fail, you have D in place, and then you start putting out the foam on the runway, you know? But you don't say, well, everything is hanging on that one pilot. Now, it seems like, at least from what you hear on the outside, that at least some people say, hey, we have these policies, quote, in place. But then often you see, well, it's like, okay, you're supposed to have your body camera on, then mysteriously body cams are not on. And you have people who say, okay, wait till we get backup, and then mysteriously people go in before the backup, you know, or you get somebody says, hey, just hang tight, you know, we don't know if this is the right person or not, we're going to get back to you, but they decide to go in and do something on their own. So my first question is, do you see any possibility with your experience as law enforcement to build in a kind of redundancy as with the pilots, so that you have like, hey, look, you know, like if before you get into trouble, you know, we have all of this backup on backup to make sure that fewer people go off the rail?
Yeah, so I'd say yes and no. Yes, in the form of, and I think someone noted this in the comments there or in the chat, how important community involvement is. So I talked about engagement from the community just on a policy level, from a policy perspective, but having community accountability boards is also vastly important. And so you see communities that have those accountability boards where police departments actually have a fallback plan. So if something happens, they can say, hey, our policy might have failed here, but here's where the community comes up to uphold the policy, right? Or to uphold the mistakes behind the policy. And because we see the failure in the policy, now it's up to us as a whole, again, talk about that holistic approach, it's up to us as a whole to fix the problem, because we don't want to have that happen again. And so when you look at those communities that have community involvement, you see less aggression from police officers as individuals, because again, they have a better understanding, and it's a unique understanding to what people outside of the uniform are going through. Now, on the flip side of that, if you don't have community engagement or community involvement, and there's a mistake on the policy level, then that mistake is upheld by structures. And it's hard to defeat a structure. It's very, very difficult to go in and say, hey, you made a mistake, now let's look at the policy. Well, guess what? Again, human resources is now going to control that policy. Well, let's talk to the human resource director. You can't do that without talking to one of our attorneys. So now you talk to an attorney is going to say, well, we've already got, and this is very specific to South Dakota now, well, we've already got set in stone by law, by codified law, that we are not going to give you our policy because we don't have to. The law protects us in a way to where we don't have to give you the policy at all. So guess what? Kick rocks. And typically it ends there. So now you're left fighting a department. Now you're left fighting human resources, and you have to go in and you have to lobby for laws to be changed. And as soon as you do that, it goes back to exactly what you said, Lawrence. The person that's in that elected position, if they're not for it, what are they going to do? They're just going to repeal it. They're going to veto a bill if it comes up or if it gets passed. Then again, specifically in this state, it's never going to get to the governor's office anyways. It's going to be shot down on the floor. And so that yes and no goes in two directions. Again, I think it starts on the local level, and locally people have to be engaged, and we can't be afraid as citizens to use our voice, because our voice is the biggest power that we have. So the vote and the voice are two different things. You don't just use your voice in the ballot box, you use your voice otherwise as well. You can write, you can text. There's so many things that we can do now in social media, where if people are afraid to go say something in person at a city council meeting, they can definitely put it on social media, and I promise it gets read. So there are methods of communicating, right? There are methods of communicating and using your voice to be very effective, but that's where engagement starts. It starts on a local level, because I promise you, as soon as the biggest economy, which is Sioux Falls, as soon as the biggest economy in the state starts to see a change in their police department, the next thing that's going to happen is the Chamber of Commerce, which is also the biggest business structure in the state. They're going to take notice of what the police department is doing. They're going to start making some adjustments. Then the state chamber is going to make adjustments. And as soon as you start to see those things economically change, then you'll start to see some laws change, and you'll start to see some policies change on the state level as well. But it has to start locally. So again, yes and no, just based on community involvement.
Well, speaking of that, what kinds of things, yes, we have the vote, and as you have pointed out, we can do things on social media. But a lot of times people don't know, okay, well, what am I going to be asking for? In other words, I could be asking for something that without knowledge of like how, what police need to do their job and what, what's under the hood of these changes, how these changes could affect us. I could go in with what sounds like to me a brilliant idea, but then when put into practice, I could be the first one, that's against it.
Yeah.
What are the kind of, let's say, low-hanging fruit things that people could do to start to affect change?
Well, the easiest thing to do, and this is something like I'm going to be contradicting myself, so I feel uncomfortable saying this. Just to put this out there, but maybe I'll put it to you this way: the number one killer in hospitals during pregnancy. Or excuse me, the number one group of individuals that are killed in hospitals during pregnancy are Black women. And that's by a wide margin. So we can all have our opinions on what needs to change within hospitals, but none of us without a medical degree have an expertise. So what I would say is we have a complaint, and this is where my contradiction comes in, because I don't like complainers. Right. I just like to get stuff done. I don't want to complain about it. I see a problem and I try to go fix it. But we have a complaint. So with that complaint, what do you do with it? You can either fix it or you can put the right people in place to fix it. And so if you don't have the expertise, or if you don't have the knowledge behind something, you only have an opinion, complain about it, because that's important. Complaining gets things seen. People know that you have already vocalized the complaint. But then number two, your solution might be just to put the right person in the room. You don't have to have an opinion on what needs to change. But guess what? There's some people who have done the work, who have studied, who have the education behind them, and put years of dedication into that problem. There are people out there doing that work, but they're not in the room. They're not making the decisions. So maybe the solution is making sure that those people are involved on your behalf, because those are your true representatives, right? We go back to the leader versus elected official conversation. A lot of the people making the decisions don't accurately affect or represent us. The people in the nonprofit world, those on the ground level, those are the individuals that are really doing the work. Those are the people that know the people. They know the community better than anybody else. But guess what? They only can decide what's in their nonprofit. They're not affecting policies. They're not affecting any changes. City ordinances are not changing because of things that nonprofit leaders are doing. It's just not. And so as much as we want to harp on public-private relationships, that's not the reality that we live in. The decisions are made by elected officials and not actual leaders. So as soon as we get those people in the room, those people at the table, then we'll start to see effective change.
Well, I think that sort of hovers around the question of the specific ideas that we can get, that will get people engaged, because the things that you're talking about, they have to sort of gain momentum and kind of reach a critical mass where something actually starts to happen. But what kinds of things can people do to increase the engagement of police and police policymakers, and more granularly, the police officers themselves with the community, so they don't see Julian as a uniform. They see Julian as Julian and know that he's got a job to do, and then to me, that seems like the more that's felt, the less there's this dichotomy between the person on the inside of the uniform and the person who's trying to act a part of the costume that they're playing.
Yeah, so I'll talk about that from two perspectives: the in the uniform perspective and out of the uniform. So first off, from the community or the granular level perspective, I would say just understanding the person behind the badge is very, very important, because again, it goes back to them just wanting to get home at the end of their shift. It goes back to them wanting to be next to their spouse. So here's what's missed from the community. You put the uniform on, and there is a roller coaster. Although we are taught to remove emotions, we're trained to remove emotions. There's a roller coaster of emotions that you have to deal with while you're on duty. I could in an 8-hour shift, I can go and I can make a traffic stop, which as I'm walking up to the car, I have no clue who's in the car. I have no clue what's in the car. I have no clue, if they're going to speed away from me or if they have a gun to shoot at me. All of those things have happened, right? Not just to me, but to many law enforcement officers in the state. I don't know if they're going to get out of the car and start running. I don't know if they're going to get out of the car and try to steal my vehicle, because guess what? That stuff happens. We might not think it does, but that stuff happens on a daily basis, even here in South Dakota. And so we look at just things from the traffic stop to now my next call after I've been emotionally on an emotional high. I can go to a call to now where I'm talking to someone to where I have to talk them out of suicide. So my emotional high from chasing someone or from having a gun pointed at me in the next 10 to 15 minutes is now at an emotional low, and I'm having to deal with someone who is in a critical state of a mental health crisis. And so I have to bring my mind and my emotions down to that level. And then right after that, I can go to a domestic violence case to where I'm protecting someone, whoever's in a domestic case. And so at the end of an 8-hour shift, it feels like you've worked a week straight. It is exhausting. And you do that day after day after day, year after year. And so you put in 25 to 30 years of that, and you have that experience. That is detrimental to a human being. So I think from a community perspective, understanding all of the things that law enforcement officers do, it's very, very vital to moving forward to just saying, hey, how can we, because we seem to focus on just the one thing. Hey, he killed such and such, or she killed such and such. We got to change that policy. Well, law enforcement officers do a whole lot of other things other than just walk into situations where they have to pull out a gun on someone, right? That's just the thing that we see. That's the thing that's in front of our face. So again, from the community perspective, understanding that, because that's important, because that gets you to the human being and what that human is dealing with day after day. I've come in my law enforcement journey to be very open about this, because of the things that I deal with, and it's tough talking about it every time, no matter how many times I say it. But because of the things that I deal with, and because of the things I'm afraid to deal with, because just because I remove my emotions and put the uniform on doesn't mean I don't have fears. So because of all of those things, I have nightmares 2 or 3 times a week. I have night sweats. I see a therapist, all of those things to help me balance the chemicals and that emotion within my own body, that I can't go see a doctor for and get prescribed medicine for, because if I'm prescribed certain medicines that the general public can be prescribed to help with some of that anxiety, then I can't perform my job. I can't hold a gun. I can't drive a vehicle. And so the things that can help general community members can't help law enforcement officers. We have to figure out other ways to deal with that. So again, looking at that person as being more human and the things that they're dealing with, and because they're dealing with that, I can guarantee you that their spouses and their children are dealing with the same things. Now we're able to see that person as more of a human and not just a superhero who made a mistake all the time. And then on the flip side, and I know we're running out of time, so I'll be quick. On the flip side of that, from the perspective of an officer, and this is where this is going to be more personal for me. I am the only Black state law enforcement officer in this entire state, the only one. And so for my brothers and sisters in uniform who don't know what I go through as a Black man first, and then have to put the uniform on, it's a struggle. And so because of some of the things that I've said, and this is not just, I'm bringing it personal because it's me in this state, but I'm also a member of an association. And I don't lead anything in there, but I'm a member of an association. It's the National Black State Troopers Association. And there's not a one Black state trooper in this country who don't all deal with this. We all deal with the issue of putting on the uniform and having our brothers and sisters in uniform not understand what I have to deal with personally. And so that hurts. I've been in the position to where I've either said something or done something from a personal level, and because they in uniform don't understand things, I've been in a position where I've called for backup and backup hadn't arrived, right? I've been in positions where I've responded to a gun call, and typically the cavalry shows up when there's a gun involved, but I've been the only person, responding to that call, and then those who were supposed to respond went to lunch at the same time to leave me on my own. I've also been in positions to where there have been more, and I'm also not afraid to say that I'm more liberal than most police officers. And so I tend to vote Democrat, not 100% of the time, but I tend to vote Democrat. And so I've been in positions to where, people in uniform tell me that, hey, I know you're running for city council, Julian, but you can't say if you're a Democrat or Republican. But then when there's a superior who's running for office, sheriff, they can put political signs all over the office. As a matter of fact, there were Trump signs all over the office, and not just all over the office. This person's office is right next to mine, and then they surrounded both of our doorways with these Trump signs, and you know how that affects someone when you have to bring your personal opinion into work. I tend to try to keep my personal opinions out of work because it's not okay when someone of color or a Black or brown person does it, but it is definitely okay when someone else does it. And so not having the support of the organization during that is another thing. So again, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say we out of time now. So,
Yep,
but this is a conversation we definitely should be, we should be pursuing. So I hope you'll agree to come back with us again and continue this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and just to wrap it up very quickly, I think the conversation is there. I know we're talking about George Floyd and the aftermath and all of that because of the anniversary, but it stems far above and beyond George Floyd because it started way before George Floyd. And we have to make sure that we keep all of that in mind. So I'd be happy to come back and discuss anything that you guys want to discuss.
Thank you very much, Julian. Thank you all of you for joining us. We'll be back same time, same station next week. See you then.